Our book lovers will have to wait at least another 4 years to access the Johannesburg City Library. The building has been closed since 2021 due to structural and fire safety concerns. Library and Information Association of South Africa President Nazeem Hardy joins us tonight. Nazeem, good evening to you. Thank you for your time. It seems gone are the days where one would just be able to go to a local library, at least in neighborhoods where they've traditionally had them, just for a read.
No, that is true. And I think, this is an unfortunate situation. I understand that a lot of it also relates to the fact that it is a heritage building. And I think heritage buildings comes with its own complications. There are quite a number of public libraries that are in heritage buildings. And unfortunately, it is, when something happens to those buildings, it's not a simple matter of just getting a contractor in, doing something, and off you go, and the library opens again. I think there's all sorts of other considerations that come into play. And I think, unfortunately, in the case of the Joburg Library, this is what is happening here. But 4 years, I think it is quite tragic that people would have to wait that long for something like this to be fixed.
Nazeem, one of the difficulties, of course, is that we don't need more libraries being closed. We, in fact, need more libraries being opened because, as I mentioned earlier, depending on which neighborhood you live in, you've either had a library that has been established for decades, or you're one of those that has just, if you're fortunate enough, maybe have libraries that are not fully equipped, that sometimes are not fully accessible to the entire community or population in a particular district.
No, that is true. I think we can all agree, and I think it is known that we need more libraries. And certainly, not just public libraries, we need school libraries probably at a greater rate than we even need public libraries. And to a large extent, the public library has become the school library. But yes, we definitely do not need libraries closed, and I think that's the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in, that more and more libraries are not necessarily accessible to communities when it is needed. And there's various elements that come into play there. It's not just, for example, here we're looking at a structural issue that needs to be fixed, that affects the access to a library, but we find nowadays very often in communities, libraries are inaccessible because of vandalism, because of theft, etc. And I think it leads to an unfortunate situation where I think very often it is people who need the library the most that very often does not have access to a library.
Let's talk about the challenges that, again, we're facing. Yes, we might need more libraries, but it also speaks to the kind of culture that we form in our society and a culture around reading, so that even where there are libraries, those libraries are in use. How are we faring on that score?
I think that libraries are still seen as a trusted institution. I think recently Nalibali did, together with the National Library, did the reading barometer and the reading survey, and it really had a broad definition of how people read, which I think was really important. But one of the aspects that was tested in the barometer and the survey are people's attitudes towards a public library and what they actually find there. And I think we were quite pleasantly surprised in terms of how people viewed public libraries. And I think there tends to be a more favorable view of a public library, or people's memory of it. And so I think it is a trusted institution, and therefore it is something that needs to be built on. I think the unfortunate part in terms of challenges is that we're still sitting with an institution, while it is maybe seen favorably by members of the public, it is unfortunately an unfunded mandate. So very often it kind of lags in terms of municipal concerns, in terms of how they channel money towards it, whether the funding is available necessarily, up front for things to be done, not just the building or building of a library, but actually to provide the kind of services that people need. And I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. It's a battle that we've been fighting since the dawn of democracy in South Africa, and short of a constitutional change, we're not necessarily going to see that changing anytime soon. But really, I think the funding issue is at the root of what we see happening to libraries. Even if we look at Joburg, for example, if one has to really probably dig very much deeper into it, it is also possibly that things have not been done over years, but simply because libraries are not at the top of the agenda when it comes to funding. And this is the continual problem that we have. And so more and more libraries are losing staff. Things are not being fixed, which is probably endemic to a lot of institutions in South Africa. And so, it kind of slides backwards all the time. And so even if people necessarily want it, people need it, there's not necessarily the funding to actually do the things that you need to do to make the institution or the public library accessible to everybody.
Nazeem, what would you describe as the opportunity cost here?
I think that I think very much, like I said, library, I think is really a trusted institution, not just in South Africa. I think it is across the world. I think we see that people view the library in a very specific way, in a very favorable way. And I think a library plays a fundamental role in democratizing information and access to information. And I think at a time in our country and in the world where the access to credible information, access to information plays a crucial role, I think, in people's lives. I think the public library becomes, that space that is more and more crucial to people's daily lives and how they actually interact with society, with politicians, with very many things in the country. And so I think we need people to also to speak up and to people to actually voice the need for services like a public library. And I think sometimes when things like this happens, it presents that opportunity for people to actually make themselves heard and say, but this is what we want. We are the taxpayers, and therefore this is what is actually important to us. And really, I think we have opportunities here when these things happen. While it sounds really tragic, 4 years, but really, I think we've seen a lot of outcry about the City of Joburg Library, and it needs a groundswell of people to actually come to the fore and say, this is what we actually want. We've seen it in Cape Town when libraries were about to be closed. People stood up, people made their voices heard, and we saw an about face about closing a library, and 2 years down the line, the libraries are still open. So again, I think, here's the opportunity for people to actually make known how they feel about institutions like libraries, and what it actually means to them.
Nazeem Hardy is with the Library and Information Association of South Africa. He's the president of that organization.